history lesson on RJ, the man, Roy Jones, Superman himself, as he called himself back in the day. To start off, obviously, we talk about the Seoul Olympics, and to get robbed, right? To dominate the Olympics and to obviously be robbed, and was still, despite not winning the gold medal, and we know he should have won it, despite not winning it, we're aware that he was the fighter of the Olympics. He was the fighter of the Olympics, and so to start your career that way, essentially, and then moving through the pro ranks, winning your first world title bout against the executioner himself, the alien, whatever he'd like to call himself, but B-Hop, Bernard Hopkins, who's also one of my favorite fighters, period. And so to beat Bernard Hopkins soundly, both of them essentially in their prime, or maybe a little bit before it, but nonetheless, both of them going for their first world title, and it was not a close fight. Now, did Roy just hurt Bernard? No, Bernard wasn't in serious trouble throughout the fight, but it was an easy fight to judge, easy fight to score, and of course, Roy Jones won it. And to put that into some type of perspective, Bernard would not lose for another 10 years after losing to Roy Jones. So that goes to show you just how good Roy is, and that goes to show you just how good Bernard was going to become and was already at the time. So I think just to see the transition of Roy, that was when Roy became world champion, and that's when he was kind of, I would say at that point in his career, really starting to make news and noise in terms of as a professional. And then we move on to him facing a guy that I think in the history of the sport may be underrated in a lot of respects. Maybe not, I wouldn't say underrated to people that really follow the sport, but underrated to maybe mainstream. And that's Lights Out. James Toney. James Toney is one of the most skilled fighters ever. And so to paint a picture of what we got going on, it's 1994. We got an undefeated Roy Jones going up against an undefeated 44-0 James Toney. Now, James Toney was a throwback fighter. And what I mean by a throwback fighter is that he is a guy that he was fighting often. I'm talking even as I'm pretty sure he's probably only 25, 26 when this fight happens, when this fight takes place. And he's already at 44 wins, no losses. And I think he has a draw under his belt, but 45, 46 fights, right? And so, but as a world champion, if you look at guys before they become world champion, you'll see how often they fight. And then you see when they become world champion, you see how often they fight, right? And so I would say maybe outside of Julio Cesar Chavez, you don't typically see a fighter who stays active like that. Ali was one of the guys who would stay active. Ali had 7 title defenses in 1 year as a heavyweight. The first year after winning the fight against Sonny Liston. And then obviously we understand that he would be exiled later. But James Toney was a throwback fighter. He had beaten Michael Nunn. He had beaten Iran Barkley, who is the man that knocked out the Hitman. And I'm not talking about Bret Hart. I'm talking about Tommy Hearns. And so he had knocked out Tommy Hearns. He had beaten Tommy Hearns in a decision later. But James Toney, at this point in the game, was maybe the best pound-for-pound fighter in the sport. If not one, the number 2, certainly behind Pernell Whitaker, Sweet Pea, who was just magnificent. Also one of my favorite fighters. But James Toney is walking into this fight, obviously, as the favorite. Not a heavy favorite, but a favorite nonetheless, because you got two fighters who are undefeated, who are supremely talented, but one is tested and one is not, right? One has beaten, you talk about, just the build up to the fight, or as these guys are walking into the ring, and you're hearing Jim Lampley, one of the best commentators, in my opinion, in the history of the sport, as he's coming down to, as James is walking through him, we're talking about James he has won in every conceivable way, right? And during these 44 victories, we have seen James dominate an opponent from start to finish. We had seen James get a come from behind victory, obviously against Michael Nunn. He was down on the scorecard. We had seen him have wars and squeeze it out. We had seen early KOs. We had seen TKOs, but James had done it all, right? He had been one of the more versatile champions in the history of the sport to that point. And so Roy was untested, to say the least. Roy had beaten Bernard Hopkins and hadn't really fought a fighter of substance up until that point. And so to see Roy go out from round one, I mean, damn near not lose a round. I mean, you can make the case it was, 118, 110, 119 type of a situation. Obviously, the very famous knockdown when James taunts Roy, and then Roy, does his chicken thing and catches James. But James Toney, man, I think people just forget how great he is. I'm not sure if Pacquiao, Floyd, even Andre Ward have those guys, has a prime undefeated James Toney on their resume, let alone beating him the way he beat him, right? And so that's Roy Jones, right? And so we're talking about, we move on, and Roy would dominate so many fighters, right? He would dominate Montel Griffin. He would dominate David Telasco. He would dominate Virgil Hill. He would dominate so many different guys, Clinton Woods. But it all reached a crescendo, essentially, when he stepped up to heavyweight and he fought a guy by the name of John Ruiz. Now, John Ruiz is a man that he's not regarded as a great heavyweight, right? So let's not act like he is, right? But he was a heavyweight champion nonetheless. He's a WBA heavyweight champion. He had beaten Evander Holyfield, although Holyfield was older, but he had beaten him nonetheless. And Roy is a guy who started his career as a junior middleweight. Started his career at 154 pounds, right? Won his first world champion at 160. He is now moving up to face a heavyweight champion. He would go out to beat this man and maybe not lose one round. When Roy Jones beat John Ruiz that night, in many cases, in many respects, he had become the modern day Sugar Ray Robinson.